we'll see how this goes. All right. Shannon, have you gotten used to being called Reverend Dr. Shannon Vance Ocampo yet?
I'm always still saying like, please just call me Shannon. But I was reminded because I have like a very long last name, and in the first church I served, a lot of my ministry was children's ministry, and these little sweet 3 and 4 year olds would be trying to say like Reverend Shannon Vance Ocampo. It's like just so mean to toddlers, right? Like it's terrible. And so uh the parents, I would like say to the kids, you can just call me Shannon. And then one of the parents pulled me aside and was like, we want them to like, like learn good manners. And so like we finally settled on like Pastor Shannon would be okay. But I was also saying to these parents who wanted them to like say this super long thing, even before doctor, right? Like it's like they're 3, they can't do it. It's a lot.
I don't know that we should have toddlers learn all of our honorifics. That feels like maybe a
Exactly.
bit
I
much.
know they're so little and cute. So anyway, yeah, Shannon is, obviously fine. I say I'm like I worked on the doctoral work like more for me than like to have some Nate thing in front of my name, right? But yeah, so it just I still am just like after 25 years of ministry, I'm like Shannon is still fine with me, but then everybody's like, no, you should use it. You're a woman. You should do this. You should do that. I'm like, yes, I hear you. I hear you. So yeah, it's always interesting. But I do feel like 3 year olds should be given a pass, right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
They're
Let's
so
let's
they're
make
so
an
little.
exception
They're
for
still learning. They're
3 year olds.
still learning just to talk and form their
We'll make,
sentences.
make a
Yes.
toddler exception. Um, Before we jump into the passage, I want to just ask really quick about. So, you have a book that is on the horizon called A Garden for
Yeah.
Renewal: Ecological
Yeah.
Practices for Life and Ministry.
Yeah.
And I know that this is actually deeply connected to the doctoral work that you did. Tell
Yeah.
us a
Yeah.
little bit about the book, and do you have
Yeah.
a target date of when we might see it?
Oh my gosh, I was just emailing with the editor the last few days because, well, you and I were talking about this when we saw each other like a little over a month ago in the Catskills, right, at the Center for Earth Ethics meeting. Was like, it's just so hard to get work done in the midst of all the stuff of life, right?
Mhm.
So, yeah, so the book is with Fortress. I'm really honored to be writing with Fortress. I know you and I were talking about that. You're working on a book with Fortress too, and
Mhm.
you go and look at their roster and you're like, they picked me. I mean, you've got some of those people on this podcast for this season as well. Folks like Ched Myers, who I've like very briefly met. I'm like, really, Ched Myers? Like, he's so smart and so capable.
So
Yeah.
smart.
So, but he's also like a really nice person.
Yes.
And yeah, but brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Shout out to Ched Myers. So. Yeah, so the doctoral work that I did was I had a research cohort of clergy. This was a couple years ago now, and we just spent 6 sessions talking about why or why not are we working on ecological issues in ministry, right? Or just using ecological themes in preaching or church school or, adult study or things like that. And, or even thinking about ecological issues like when we choose where we might do a mission trip. And certainly there's lots of those, but we maybe don't talk about them as in depth. Remember, I went to Katrina recovery work over many years, like a lot of us did in New Orleans. And I think we talked a little bit back then with our folks about the ecological issues, which were so like
Mhm.
right in your face, of course, but also like what was right in your face was like rebuilding a house as well.
Right.
And like just such devastation. It almost like was obvious and not discussed at the same time. And I think there's a lot more the further in ministry we've gone, intentionality around those conversations in trips and things like that, mission trips. So, uh, but so we worked on that for 6 weeks with a cohort of clergy and um, spent time talking about things like liturgy and worship, activism and community engagement, preaching, and also about this question of like, who are we as disciples and how are we showing up and connected to the God of creation? And one of the things I found, we did some, all doctoral work, like you do pre and post surveys and all the statistics and stuff, um, was that it was a mixed bag in the
Mm.
cohort. Not a dig at anybody in any way, because we're all a mixed bag, all of us, right? But some people came into the cohort and went hiking every week with a hiking group, and were really doing a whole bunch of stuff in nature and very connected and doing activism. And other people were saying, like, it's really hard for me to like just take my Bible and go sit in the local park and do my devotions. Like,
Mm,
it's like physically hard for me to like just feel okay sitting out in public in the park on a bench or at a picnic table or something. And the gamut in between those things. And the other thing clergy were bringing up is that they notice ecological themes in the Bible as they're preparing for preaching and whatever the pericope is for that Sunday, and the text in the lectionary, whatever lectionary they're using, or even if they're just doing a sermon series, and feeling like I don't know enough about this to say something about this. And
mm,
so I'm just going to let this part of the connection I'm seeing go and go on to another theme related to this passage. I feel like I don't know enough about the environment or science, or even I don't understand enough about this textually. Like I
mhm,
just didn't, we talked about other textual issues in seminary, and I didn't get a lot in this area. And, um, and also, folks were feeling one of the questions, demographic questions I asked before we got started was like, can you name, I think it was five local animal species in your area, like native animal species? And like some people struggled with that question.
mhm.
And also asking, and without looking it up, right? Like, don't like
Right,
go Google
right,
it to answer the
right.
question, like just like answer the question. And or like, do you know who the native folks are for your community? Like, who was here before all of us were here?
Mhm,
And like, do you know that history? And I also asked a question about environmental racism. Like, can you define it? Do you know, does that phrase make sense to you? And again, very mixed responses on all of those things. I was most surprised because majority of the folks in the study group were in the Northeast, somewhere in other parts of the United States, and even Puerto Rico. But um, like, people couldn't, like, the five animals was hard. And in
mm.
the Northeast, like, we just have a lot of woodland creatures that are in our yards normally, and there's more than five of them in kind of the average Northeast environment, unless you're in like a really, really built space. But I mean, everybody's got squirrels and chipmunks and
Mhm,
rabbits and the occasional problematic groundhog, or like a cardinal or a robin, or like some super, like, what for me feels like a kind of basic set of animals. But it, maybe that's just not the case, right? So that
mhm,
was a learning for me as well. So we did that work, and I was really trying to get us to interact with different voices each week. So also using voices that were not in the typical canon of ecological voices. So, folks of color, indigenous voices. And so we worked through all that for 6 weeks, and I learned a lot in that cohort. And it got me thinking about this question of, like, who are we as people in creation, and who are we as ecological people, and how are we connected to the God of creation, and that need of going back and doing almost that personal work of getting in touch as, like, I'm a creature in creation. uh God is the God of creation. How am I in touch with those pieces? And then from there, building all the other professional pieces around, like, how might I preach about this? How might I talk about this? How might I work with my congregation? And we, of course, also had some conversation in this cohort about, a lot of people felt worried to bring up ecological themes in worship, because for some communities that might seem like a hot topic, or like a something controversial. Not in every community. So that was also, and not wanting to misspeak into something that feels controversial, and then maybe creating more problems by talking about it.
mm,
So those were sort of hindrances. So again, it was very short term. And what I've appreciated in the years since is, of course, like, people like Leah Shade have been doing work in this area, preaching, and I used some of her work in this cohort, and introduced her, like, who is my neighbor exercise in preaching to people in that cohort. That was really a very helpful, I think that's a very helpful practical exercise for preachers who are just starting in that area, or just religious leaders in general, in any kind of religious leadership. It's not just preaching. And and I love that there's some really interesting studies now coming out from the BTS Center, from your organization in concert with them, that's beginning to look at more of these things. And now these cohorts are getting set up, because that's one of the things I was noticing in my research, was that, they ask you about like next steps, is that I do think, uh, I noticed in the cohort, people would more say, oh, yeah, I would kind of keep going with this if we could stick together and keep working on this in
Mm,
community and talking about our various ministries from where we are, and like hopping on Zoom every other week and chatting about what are we trying to do, or maybe doing a sermon series together as a group. And those have always been good modalities for us in local ministries and as pastors to think about our work, but to think about it thematically, as well around this. So I love that there's all, and again, it's not because I worked on my DMin project on this, right? That's not why, but these other groups were also looking at these issues. And I like that this is a growing piece in the sort of larger ecosystem, right, of clergy
mhm,
resources, and there's more rolling out. And the real issue is now, of course, getting folks to choose to do this for their continuing education over something else, because I think anxiety is driving so much of our decision making in congregational ministry. As I work with pastors, it's hard work being a local church pastor these days,
yeah,
and so many competing interests. But the other side of it is that people in the pews want to talk about these issues
yeah,
desperately.
yeah.
um I try to preach I'm like the itinerant preacher, like I'm always bouncing around and in different churches every Sunday. But when I preach on ecological issues, I always have people come up to me in the line after church, after worship, and there's like say things to me like, oh my God, I'm so glad you brought something up about this. I'm so stressed out
Mm,
about either just like the climate crisis is like a big thing, or this specific issue, or I'm like terrified for my grandchildren, like what world are they going to live
mm,
in, and I'm like so brokenhearted as someone in my 70s 80s that like I'm not going to be around, and I think that their life is going to be so challenging, because the climate is going to be so problematic wherever they are on this planet, and I'm like desperately sad about that at the end of my life and feel so stuck and scared. Or and especially the press area I work in is very coastal. The regional governing body I lead, coastal Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. We have a lot of people that in our churches that maybe worked at Woods Hole or some of these really interesting oceanographic institutes. We have some retired ministers that volunteer on whale watches and things like this. And so they're saying, oh, I've had this professional life, but I've never been able to connect it at
mm,
church. And I have so much to share.
yeah.
I've been working on marsh. I met somebody recently who said, I've been working on marsh restoration my whole life
Mm,
on this one estuary and this one marsh in southern
mm,
Rhode Island. And I really wanted to tell people in my church about it. Nobody's ever asked me about it. Right. Like, and like this person's like knows so much about the like the really micro ecosystem around this local church and this ministry and this marsh. Like what a gift, right? It could be so cool. So so there's that whole cadre of things. So that got me thinking about the like writing more about it. And at the same time I was practicing all these things in regenerative agriculture on this small scale in my garden. And it sort of dawned on me one day, like these practices in regenerative agriculture can be really interesting metaphorical springboards to talk about these other pieces, but also to talk about how some warped theological ideas have gotten us stuck. Um,
mm,
some of Willie Jennings' work, Christian
mm.
imagination work, I think has some, and he's doing work on doctrine of creation now. So yeah, so that's sort of like a longish preview, but that's what got me thinking, and that's what I'm working on in my writing. Yeah, the manuscripts will hopefully be done, and by the end of September is the target right now, and I'm getting there. I've been on two really fantastic writing retreats. One was with the Boston Theological Center, the BTS Center, and with eco writers. And your colleague Avery, who's on sabbatical right now, was there, and that was fantastic to be writing with other eco writers for 5 days and having people to bounce ideas off of. And we read some of each other's work and hearing what other people are working on. That was actually the most accelerating space I've been in for a while. So that was I know that was an experimental writing retreat for them, but they definitely knocked it out of the park. With who they brought and the group of people they assembled. So it was really amazing to write with all those people and folks thinking about all, I mean, the ecological crisis is so incredibly large and minute at the same time. And
Mhm.
what was so great about that space is there were people looking at so many different aspects of it, right? And you don't have to just, none of us can work on everything, right? And
Mhm.
so working on what you feel called to and what you're gifted for and what's close to your heart was what was going on that week. And listening to all those different um, people was just so energizing, and exciting that there's such a gift and wealth of people, community around us that are working on this big, big thing that we're all in the midst of. And it's so heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad. And Daniel Wolpert, who
Yeah.
was also on that retreat, is going to be on the show in a week or
Yes.
so.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
I'm glad that
Yeah.
there's so much synergy between the BTS Center and our work. And
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah. It's a
glad that we have
great,
the overlap.
they're doing such cool stuff. Yeah. They're, uh, what's it called, their convocation in
Mhm.
September fortunately is the week of my birthday, and my parents are going to be in town. And I'm having maybe like a large birthday this year. And say that quiet, say that like really quietly. um, but yeah, Leah Penniman's going to be there, and of course I'm like really close to Soulfire, so I get the benefit of like being able to volunteer with them every once in a while,
Oh, nice.
and go over there occasionally. And such a amazing space as well, and just watching their work also like closely from afar as well. But so they're just pulling in some really amazing people as well.
Yeah.
And I think Leah Penniman's work, and not just her writing, but like the actual work they're doing, is some of the most interesting stuff these
Yeah.
days. That kind of work that Soulfire's doing, and others are beginning to pick up. And so yeah, there's a lot of resources, and there's a lot of things holding us back, right?
Yeah.
That we can't control for. But um, I always kind of harken back. Margaret Wheatley, the sociologist, and writes about creating islands of sanity amidst the
Mm,
insanity. And I just think about that a lot, of how are we, whatever we're doing, how are we creating these islands of sanity wherever we are? Because it is insane what's going on around us.
yeah. Absolutely.
Um, yeah.
Absolutely.
So those are some of my early thoughts in
Yeah.
general. Yeah.
Great. Well, let's jump into our passage, because I think there's also
Yeah.
just some amazing connections here. So we're looking at Matthew 13:31 to 33, and then
Yep.
jumping to verse 44 for some reason, but let's just stick with, with that.
Yeah.
So here's our reading. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest of the shrubs. It becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Skipping down to verse 44, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and reburied. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angel will come about and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Mm.
Have you understood all of this? They answered,
Mm.
yes. And he said to them, therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household, who brings out of his treasures what is new and what is old. Okay, so where is creation in this series of parables?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you started out by saying like, why did they skip verses? Well, like 31 through 33 was what was pulled out of last week's. There's this gap from
Mhm.
last week, the pericope in Matthew from last week, and it skips over those verses, and then they get stuck over in this week. So I would like to speak to the lectionary person who makes these decisions. Because I have some issues with their choices. But
I
yeah,
have
so
questions.
I have questions, and that's like way above our pay grade, right? So education, pay, experience, whatever. I'm not a specialist in Greek and Hebrew and all those things. I studied them, but I'm like dabbled in them. Yeah, so that's I think an interesting piece of this, right, is that there's like a carve out, and obviously creation very much in some of the many of the all the examples, right, in these parables, right? So you've got your mustard seed, you've got the pearl, you have the net and the fish, you've and the leaven even, right?
Mhm.
Baking bread is the ingredients of it, come from the earth, of course. So there's all those pieces in here. And it also goes back at the end of the parable, we go back to this weeping and gnashing of teeth thing, this the
Mm.
fear mongering part of like how bad it's going to be if you don't do things the right way, which is also in the passage from last week. Last week it was also being thrown into like the furnace and like being burnt up. um so there's a little bit of like scary violence thrown into both of these passages as well. And also where creation is in this passage is like, who's Jesus talking to and where is Jesus when these passages are going on? So that the 2 weeks before this, of course, started with this is a great run through Matthew this summer. These parables are all ecological, and Gary Navin, of course, has like written a whole book about this section of
Mm.
Matthew, which is some of what I've been looking at in my prep, because it's just his stuff is so fantastic. But
So good.
um, Jesus for Farmers and Fishers. For shout out to that book for people listening to the podcast. If you've not read that book, go get it, download it,
Highly recommend.
stop everything you're doing, read this book now, uh, and do everything that Gary is talking about in the book, and only listen to him. I don't mean it that seriously, but like it's really such a
It's
great.
so
It is.
good.
I mean, isn't it?
It's
It's such a
so
great.
good.
I actually like have extra copies, and I like hand them to people sometimes. I'm like, you don't have this book, here you go. So yeah, I think it's so great. And so he talks about it's so in 2 weeks ago, as we start with this with chapter 13, Jesus is like in this house on a lake, right? I think it's supposed to be like Galilee, right? Like he's here, and it seems like he's in one of his times where he's trying to like get away from the crowds and like get some downtime and some peace, because everybody's always like grasping and following at Jesus, and he just needs some like quiet time. And he gets up early in the morning out of this like house on this beach, um to walk the beach early in the morning to get quiet, and all of a sudden the crowds are there on the beach with him. Like he's like he can't even like just walk the beach for 5 minutes early in the morning as the sun is coming up and have some quiet and some peace. And then he gets in this little boat, and he's like, I sort of like imagine it kind of like tethered to shore, like a rowboat, something really small, like a dinghy, in today's language, right? So there's so many people on the beach who want to listen to Jesus, that he has to like get in this like small boat and be like a little away from them so they can hear him and he can be connecting to them. Um, so that's where all these passages are coming from, and these parables about the mustard seed, all of that. That's what's he's still on the beach, and he's still
Mhm.
like they're still on the beach. He's still in the boat, and they're having this dialogue about these parables. And I think it's also so interesting that these people, again, Jesus is outside. He's talking. He's teaching outside, as he almost always is. Um, it's early in the morning, and these people are, as Gary says in his book, these people are farmers and fishers. And so
Mhm.
like I was pointing this out in my sermon last Sunday, like the prime time for a farmer is early in the morning.
Mhm.
So whatever Jesus has to say here is so important to them, and
Mhm.
their time with Jesus is so important that they're giving up their peak work hours to
Yeah.
have gotten up early, walked from their fields to this beach, to make sure they're there when Jesus opens the door in the morning to get some quiet time and to like make him talk to them again. Like they're desperate to talk to Jesus, and maybe giving up like income to be there, because it's this prime time in the morning. And it seems like it's definitely a mixed crowd. It's men, it's women, it's children, because some of the things he gives parables that are both like farming parables
Mhm.
and that are meant to speak in almost coded language only people who really understand agricultural language will get.
Mhm.
But then he's also bringing up this household language around bread baking, which
Mhm.
probably in a again, not everything is so easily black and white gendered here, but it seems like he's trying to nuance this here for different
Mhm.
audiences. And the passage that these parables come out of from last week that they were stuck in the middle of, he's talking about that the grains of wheat and the weeds. And Gary's exegesis of this, I say Gary like I know him, he's my friend, I've never met him, but Gary Navin, I want to be maybe a little bit more formal here. Right, like his exegesis of this is so interesting because this Scottish scientist in the 1850s did some like analysis with other people that know a lot about these very specific weeds and wheat
Mhm.
from this part of the Middle East thousands of years ago, right? So these are science people who know stuff you and I do not know.
Mhm.
Um, and the weed is called a darnel seed,
Mhm.
and it mimics, so like when they grow along each other in the field, this is going back to last week to get into this week, the weed looks just like the wheat. So the people in the field are saying, "Oh my gosh, we have all these weeds growing up with this really good wheat. Should we just like yank it all out to protect the good wheat?" And the main farmer is saying, "Oh no, please don't do that because like you might end up, taking out the wrong thing. It's hard to distinguish." But that's not like what Jesus says. Like he's just like gives a very simplistic. So like maybe the people listening who are the problematic people, like the empire people or the people who are harming this group of farmers and these agricultural people, um, don't understand what Jesus is talking about. But he's giving them like deeply coded information that this weed has. You don't even know when you're looking at the weed, but it can has two. There's two types of the darnel weed, and they have toxins, and one of the toxins will like really harm people and livestock, so you don't want to feed it then to your livestock. But the other one is a helpful toxin that's toxic to insects, and those are the same insects that are going to eat the wheat. And so it's like a natural pesticide, like a organic natural pesticide. And like Jesus is telling them basically like be like that so that you can infiltrate the empire and you can be growing up alongside something, and they don't know that like you're the revolutionaries, but he's like saying it in super coded ways to them that you would never know unless you really understood like what these plants. And so they like did this like research in the 1850s, these Scottish people, and figured this out, and then that turned into some really interesting background exegesis. So when you get into these parables, it's so annoying almost that whoever did this lectionary, I'm annoyed with whoever did the lectionary, I just want to say that, pulled these pieces out of last week because he's like a little bit more explicit when he talks about the mustard seed and these other things that start small but can get big. So that's a continuation of last week, but it's stuck in this week. And then Jesus is back in the house later trying to like see if the disciples got what he was talking about, and they only understand the surface stuff, like because they're not farmers, they don't understand these intricacies about this wheat and about this seed and these other things. And so he's doing it here too. Like he's giving really interesting, explicit information that only if you're a farmer or a fisher will understand, because he's also talking about fish later. And then he's also tracking back to his disciples, like, do you understand yet? Do you get it? I mean, in Matthew, the disciples are not as like obtuse as they are in Mark. Like Mark really does a number on the disciples, like, but Matthew does like a number on them, but not as bad as Mark. Like Mark is definitely like not happy with the disciples and thinks they're pretty dumb. Mark is like maybe they're redeemable and like could get there. Like Mark has like more generous view of the disciples. So like we're gonna like give them like some cliff notes afterwards and try to help them understand. So yeah, so it's so interesting, that passage, and there's so much, like he's both like in the ecological space talking to them and the people listening to him, are people who work the land or work the waters and are deeply connected physically with those places
Mhm.
and know them so intimately. People who have incredible, um, just smarts and intelligence about what they're doing. And so when Jesus is this thing about like sorting fish, like the good fish from the bad fish, like that's very interesting language, like good and bad. Like it's such black and white binary language. And like is he sorting fish because like some of them just are like baby fish that got caught in the net and throwing them out and those are the bad fish, and like
Right.
a good fisher person will like measure the fish, right?
Mhm.
When they like bring them up. And like I've been out fishing in the ocean, and like when you're pulling in fish, you measure them to a little bit, and like people can eyeball them who know what they're doing. But if they're too small, you want to throw them back in if you love the fish and you want to fish in 20 years, because you don't want to like take all the young fish out. You want to give them a chance to grow up and reproduce and be part of the life cycle, and take the older fish and eat those fish, right? And so is that what that is?
Mhm.
Because it doesn't, it just says the good and the bad. And like
Mhm.
I wonder about like that. Is it really the people sorting the fish and are doing it because they are sorting ecologically
Yeah.
and thoughtfully? So is Jesus there talking about how you tend to the environment around you, and how you take what you need and you don't take the things that still need time and give it space? I mean, what's the coded language in there? And
Mhm.
something's in there for the, and so some of the people on the beach are fisher people probably, or there's other boats around him listening, but most of them are probably people listening to the land parables that are about things that grow. And of
Mhm.
course the pearl's interesting too, because then you've got to, I guess there were pearls in that area, right? Or there was, um, oysters or shells, mollusks that were creating pearls. And so, but knowing when to pull one of those for a pearl is also quite an art. From the little bit I've, seen YouTube videos and stuff about like how you know which when you like would harvest for a pearl. I'm always like hoping when I'm on the beach and I get one of these things, I'm like, if I crack it open,
If
am
I'm
I
going
going to
to
be
find a
so,
pearl.
for my years of like since childhood of beachcombing, like, am I going to end up finding the really cool thing? It has not happened to me because I don't know which shells to pick.
Mm. I wouldn't even know where to
I'm
start.
not a shell. I mean, I love shells, but I'm not a shell professional for you, so, yeah, so I mean, he's really getting into such deep stuff. And so I think that's what I've been talking about in my sermons recently is like, we're listening to these passages as people who, have ecological imaginations and are interested in these things. But um, maybe somebody sitting in the pews is a specialist in these areas, and this level of scientific specificity that Jesus is getting into here makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, but we're also just reading it as much surface as the disciples are to a degree.
Mm.
The other thing that Gary Nabin points out in this book, which I think is so interesting about Jesus, is this is not the community Jesus is from and grew up
Mm.
in. And so this is not what he was getting as sort of indigenous or like taught childhood intelligences. He grew up in a little bit more of like an urbanish environment.
Mm.
And Joseph was a woodworker, right? And so he was around more tradespeople growing up, so like that sort of stuff you sort of imbue as a child. So Jesus definitely had to go, and he had spent some time clearly getting schooled on things, so
Mm.
then he could talk in a way that the people he wanted to do ministry would understand.
Mhm.
So Jesus somewhere, and of course it's not recorded. There's so much stuff about Jesus I wish we could know, and like the Bible just never like told us. Like there's so much of his life is just sort of like missing, right? It was just like missing all these critical years of like, what was he doing? Was he apprenticing on a farm or apprenticing on a fishing boat? Like what was he up to? Like how did he get all this knowledge that was not what he was getting as a child, that
Mm.
would just be imbued in you because it was in your sort of like world. Um, but Jesus clearly took the time to learn very specific information, and not just learn it but understand it and then figure out how to talk about it in a way to get other pieces of his message across, and also to build safety for his community,
Mm.
speaking coded language that only they understood. So there's so much going on in these passages. that's really, really interesting. And of course, is more than what you could do in one sermon on one Sunday, right? You've got to unpack it over a period. Like these passages are almost better for like adult like Bible study over a couple
Mhm.
weeks where you really deeply think about all these things like what is going on here. Jesus is really like he's playing a very deep game here.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
is really what I think the Farmers and Fishers book gets us to look at is like Jesus is working something very deep here.
Mhm.
Um, very, very deep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, if we've ever seen mustard seeds, I mean, of course, I used to do children's ministry, so I too, like, went to the grocery store and grabbed some mustard seeds in the spice aisle, right? They're like, they're so tiny, and so
Mhm.
thinking about and that, of course, is just a great metaphor, right? But is
Mhm.
any of us that have grown something from seed know how small seeds are, and then how interesting they are when they grow.
Mhm.
And the mustard seed, of course, isn't just like it's like almost like a tree that's like a bush when
Mhm.
it's growing natively. So I think that's something that can be pulled out in preaching, is really talking about it's not just like a little like boxwood shrub in your yard. I mean, it's like a it's like 10, 12 feet ish high. We're talking about like trunks that like feel like a tree, but it's still talked about as a bush. Um, and it's also creating homes for other pieces of creation for birds and things like that. And so that on its own is a great thing to pull out. But I've also read a commentary recently that's like, don't talk about the mustard seed. It's overused. Use the other pieces. Uh, like the mustard seed has gotten too much airtime. Don't do it.
That's kind of that's kind of
Yeah.
ridiculous. I'm gonna go ahead
There
and
was
call
a
that ridiculous.
there was a I forget which commentator it was that like I was because I've read a couple commentaries this week was like we should have a moratorium on talking about the mustard seed. It's over talked. Use the other ones.
Well,
So
that's nonsense.
it's yeah, I feel like that, yeah. But I chatted about that a little bit last week, and I'll probably talk about one of the others this week. But yeah, there's a lot going on here.
Mhm.
There's a lot going on here, and I'm so interested in that idea of they left so early in the morning to be with Jesus. So like he was not saying surface things. He was saying things that were like life and death in these parables, and about the social situation that they were finding themselves in. This um, ecocide that was going on in that time period. Ellen Davis writes about it, that this was the scene of the crime, right? This was the place that was being monocropped in that time. This is the place that was being resource. I think she used the words resource sink, is what Ellen Davis
Mm.
writes about this area, and how the Roman Empire was just sucking all the life out of it, both like the soil by monocropping and just growing one thing on these fields and like demanding it all be wheat, for example, or other things, to like dragging all of the fish out, um, and of these waterways, and then the people that were doing the harvesting of the food and of the fish were themselves as much of a dispensable, disposable resource, right? That was just cast away. So
Yeah.
Jesus is also talking about like kind of almost like conservation in that time, right? Like putting some fish back.
Mhm. Mhm.
He's like, we should not be overfishing.
Mhm.
But that's a radical thought in a situation like that, where you've got something like the Roman Empire that's like, feed me, feed me, feed me, literally, but
Yeah.
overfeed me.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot going on, because it's a lot of harm, and it's a lot of beauty, and it's a lot of um, deep language here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that what you're saying is making me think about, this is almost like if you ever watch a comedian on like on Instagram or like on Reels,
Hmm.
they're doing crowd work, and it's
Yes,
like you have to like know what's going on in your crowd so that you
yes,
can make the joke, right? Like
yes.
this is I can see him, you can almost see in your mind like Jesus
Hmm.
going around from okay, you're a fisher and you're a farmer and you
Hmm.
probably have been baking some bread and you probably own a field and and it's like,
Yeah.
it's to be able to speak the language of the people
Hmm.
who are listening.
Yeah.
That is for those of us who do any kind of communication.
Right.
But even as I think more and more about how we do, I've been really drawn to the fact that there's a difference between like climate science and ecological science and
Hmm.
climate communication. Climate science
Right.
communication is a completely
Hmm.
different field than climate science. And
Right.
how important it is that when we're talking about these issues, that we're speaking the language of the
Hmm.
people who we're talking to so they can hear it in a
Right.
way that makes sense to them.
Right.
And
Right.
this is what
Yeah.
Jesus does well.
Yeah, Jesus is such a great example of like how to do good ministry, right?
Yeah.
In this arena, like he's giving some great like pro tips here. Um, the other piece I'm thinking about is like if we want to get back to our ecological selves, right? Like if we're disconnected from creation, either as ministry leaders or people that we're trying to work with, like what language do we need to use to help people reconnect to nature, reconnect to creation, and that we are a creature in creation along with everything else, right? Like like you and I are human beings, but we're just as much as a creature in creation as the squirrel out in the yard. And like we've all seen animals have these moments of awe where it's like, oh, they're really like smelling the flowers, like they're into this, and or something else, like they're really like looking at the sky, like they're taking in beauty too. And um so how do we speak language to help people reconnect? And that's going to be different in every community. And then also like speaks to like the stuff of the heart, the stuff that's like what's oppressing your local community, and that's going to be different in different places. What's stressing out your local community, what's bringing them grief, what's breaking their heart, right? And so being able to connect those pieces with ecological things, I think can be so powerful. And it's also, Jesus is doing experiential stuff. This is all embodied ministry. Like he's out on a boat. He's not super far out, like he's right along the shoreline, but he's like on a boat. He's out there. They're physically out there. He's connecting to them in physical space. They're not in the safety of a building. The disciples need that because they're struggling and they're not so smart for Matthew, right? But like the people on the beach are the smart ones, so they're like all outside. And uh so like what does it take for us to do that kind of ministry, like help our people be more connected and also accessible. I was talking to a church recently that has had an outdoor labyrinth forever, and that I was visiting, and they were trying to figure out as their congregation has aged how to use the labyrinth because their people can't use it as much because they're getting older and they're having mobility issues. So like, do you build pathways? And another congregation in my presbytery actually just like redid their outdoor chapel to make it accessible for people that like so they built some new pathways out there. It's like if you're in a wheelchair you can get to the outdoor chapel now and worship out there, because they have summer worship, that congregation, both in the outdoor chapel in the morning and then inside a little bit later. They have two services, but they like put some money into it and made it more accessible for people, because it used to be like a really rustic outdoor chapel and you sat on some like logs outside, and that's fantastic, but over time it's become problematic and they've
Yeah.
realized the challenges with that. So like Jesus is doing that too, like he's figuring out how to be accessible to people, meet them where they are. So this invites, I think, lots of questions for us about our ministry practices and how do we create those opportunities for people, and how in getting people outside and having experiences outside do we maybe then go back and relook at these passages and like read a passage like this when we're on a boat with people, like, or on a beach, and like
Yeah.
try to feel it in a different way and try to connect with it in a different way and begin to re-wake up those ecological things in us that maybe have gotten disconnected, so that we can get back and be reconnected as people who are primarily ecological people having an ecological experience with an ecological God, right? Because that's the first act of God, is creation. And so, and Jesus is doing these conversations outside. So like how do we reconnect with that stuff?
Yeah.
Um because we're reading it all like in buildings, and we're like, you know, at least for the passages with Jesus, like we're 2000 years further in history. Like we spend so much time like on our phones and on our computers, and like those are all blessings and awesome things, and we're much more connected. But what's disconnecting us from our ecological being?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think this invites some of those pieces if we start thinking about like who's Jesus talking to, not just the actual like um, examples here, which are creation-ish examples, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a couple other things that you've pointed out that I think are really helpful in terms of thinking about um, both Jesus and the disciples. That like these are things that Jesus you're pointing out that these are things that Jesus had to learn, right?
Yeah.
And like these are things the disciples don't know. That like
hmm
there is wisdom that is in the crowd. There's wisdom
Yes.
in the people who are working the land. There's
hmm
wisdom in the people who are working the water that often isn't in the church. It often
Right.
isn't in our building. And like,
hmm
are we putting ourselves in places where we can learn the wisdom, and
Right.
again, this is one of the things that I think has been one of the major lessons of working with more of my indigenous brothers and sisters of like, am I putting myself in spaces where I can learn from people who know the
Right.
land better than I do? Am I
Exactly.
putting myself in spaces where I can take their wisdom and
hmm
add it to mine and like be
hmm
enhanced by them, like not assume that I
Yeah.
have the answers.
Yeah. And I think we've done that all over the place in the church. Like we've just sort of like been like, oh, come to church. And then
Mhm.
we're just here in church doing churchy things. And we forget that everybody's an expert in something,
Yeah.
right? Like there's so much wisdom out there. And we barely ever ask our people to tell us what they can tell us in anything. I mean, I think back to this guy who said this thing to me in the line about that was this marsh expert. And he's like, I've so wanted to tell people at church about this, but nobody ever asked me. Like for 40 years, like what I was doing in the
Yeah.
marsh. Like nobody asked him,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Or but like, do we ever like ask? We have churches that are full of farmers. They know
Yeah.
stuff. Like,
Yeah.
are we asking them to like maybe you know do a webinar for other churches and tell them about what's going on and the struggles they're having on their farm, or how they hear this parable, or how it makes sense to them? And again, going back in ministry, right? Like I go back now and I think about, oh, I took all these people to like work in New Orleans and I didn't connect the dots. Like I wish I could go back in time now. Like you think about previous, like I also think about like people that listened to my sermons my first year in ministry, very generous people right out of seminary. Like we can all go back and like now that we're a
Yeah.
little further along and
Yeah.
be like, wow, people really put up with me.
Yeah.
But I also in the first church I served, I used to take the youth group for the kickoff. You always do these like kickoff Sunday for children's ministry. Well, I had this crazy idea, and we started doing it every year. Where I took my youth group blue fishing every
Oh
year
wow.
because we were on the Jersey Shore. So we would rent a boat and go out like miles out in the ocean and bluefish for youth group as like the kickoff event. Jesus,
Wow.
like, yeah, put this in the category of Shannon's like got wacky ideas, right? But the kids, but like, have you ever been blue fishing, Derek? Like, have you ever
I
been out in the
have I
ocean?
have
Okay,
not.
so
No.
so blue fishing is a contact violence sport. I just want to say,
Okay.
bluefish are fighter fish. They have teeth. They're
Okay.
mean. They'll take off your finger if you take them off the line the wrong way. Like they'll bite your
Okay.
finger off. They're not a shark, but they have shark like attitude.
Okay.
Um, and so and they go in like swarms of bluefish, and they run with like they're like kind of like tuna, right? Like they're big, they're a meaty fish. They're a little like oily, greasy fish, right? And so, but the kids, it's like a great sport for kids because like it's really physical. You wear them out, dragging like it's a lot. You hurt the next day. Your shoulders, your back hurts because you're dragging these very heavy fish in off these lines, off the ocean. They fight you as they're coming. It's aggressive, and you've got to like flip them onto the boat when you get them close because you can't pull them off the line because, like I said, they'll take your finger off. And then like the first mate on the boat would like teach the kids like flip him onto the boat, and then he's got like literally like a spear. He's like stab him in the heart, and all this like blood. And
Oh
this is
my
a
goodness.
perfect activity for middle school boys, right? Like if you're gonna win in youth ministry, take your kids blue fishing off the Jersey Shore. It is winning. And so, because it's a little violent, it's a little bloody. These fish are big, right? But
Mhm.
they also would like tell the kids, they did the measuring thing. Like, there's certain fish, we're not going to kill them. We're not going to, like, this is a baby fish, this is a young adult fish, this is a teenager fish, right? And so was teaching the kids like on the boat also about like, but of course I didn't connect the dots and be like, oh, this is just like the Matthew passage, like, or let's talk about like conservation, or like, I just was more like, I don't want to lose a finger. But
Right.
and also like trying to keep track of, I had like about 30-ish kids on the boat with some parents, and they're out there for it was a whole thing. It was really, I really enjoyed that blue fishing, and I don't even eat fish, but like uh but I just thought it was just so much fun, and we would always catch a couple sharks as well,
Oh
because
wow.
that zone they take you out to is what they think is a where we still like don't know where great white sharks like actually have their pups. Like, they're very
Mhm.
secretive when they give birth, but they think that one of the spots is just south of Long Island off the Jersey Shore, because there seems to be, and we would always every year catch a baby great white shark.
Oh wow.
These things, yeah, it was really weird. And the kids are like, your teeth aren't very big. How many teeth? I'm like, well, did you have teeth when you were a baby? So we would talk about that. And they'd be like, oh, that's so smart, Shannon. I'm like, yeah, I just made that up. I don't really like that's what came to me as an explanation. But yeah, like that would, if like if I ever went back and redid that experience, that would be the time, as these, and these are like rough and tumble fisher people in New Jersey, but they're like they're like giving the kids very, like, they're like, we're gonna like, if, and they would bring out like a measuring tool if they were wondering if the fish was over or under and seemed to sort of be in the gray zone, right? And they would like say like, no, you put that fish back in. Like, they
Mhm.
would get on, like, they would be like, we're not murdering that fish, we're not going to eat that fish, and they would fillet them on the way back and stuff like that. But
Mhm.
uh, so they were getting these lessons about these good and bad fish. So I do think about that part a lot. And you could really do some work with that around kids and a youth group about like, how do we like both take from creation and also not take too much. And um, Robin Wall Kimmer writes about that, about how we don't take the first fruit from the serviceberry,
Mhm.
right? She writes about that in Braiding Sweetgrass, but also in the serviceberry fruit is in spring when the first fruit come up on the plant. We don't take the fruit the first, even though we really want to eat them because it's spring and they're so yummy, right? Like, we desperately want to eat them. We don't take the first. We let it be, and maybe that first is for the birds, or maybe the first is just going to fall away and become nutrition for the plant in the next cycle through some natural composting. And it's the same idea with the fish. Like, we don't take the first fish, which are the young ones. And Jesus is talking about all sorts of interesting stuff here. And so I think doing more of that experiential stuff, if you were doing this passage in non-worship, and maybe going back and repeating the blue fishing with the kids, you could maybe then get the youth group kids to like read this passage and talk about it. I wasn't
Yeah.
that smart my first few years of ministry to connect those dots.
Yeah, that's really good. I
I
mean,
just was like, this will get a lot of kids to come to youth group because we're going to go blue fishing,
there you
and
go. And
they're
and
going to get to
some.
stab some fish in the heart. I wasn't, I have to admit, in my first few years of ministry, I maybe wasn't thinking as like thoughtfully as I maybe am now. Um, but we all grow in
We
our
all
life
grow.
and in
We
our
all grow.
discipleship, right?
It's
Yeah.
all it's
So,
all part of the journey.
but
But
yeah, so these are all in here. Yeah.
I think one of the things as we think about like what are the takeaways here. I think one of the things maybe even more so than the specific parables, which are filled with all of these creation images. I think there's two things that feel like takeaways to me. One is when you have all of these parables stacked on top of each
Mm-hmm.
other, you
Mm-hmm.
realize that it's less about the individual parable and it's more about parables as a storytelling device, as a
Tool.
teaching
Mm-hmm.
device.
Mm-hmm.
But this is about something, and it's about, kind of connects to the second point that like creation can be our best teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and that like there's so much to learn if
Hmm.
we are, as you're saying, like this wouldn't have been Jesus's experience growing up, but like at
Hmm.
some point he paid attention. And at
Yes.
some point, he learned all of these
Hmm.
things about mustard seeds and about fish and
Hmm.
about,
Yeah, he
all
was
at
a
some point,
student. Yeah.
he became a
Yeah.
student of creation.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
if you start to think about some of the takeaways here, it's that
Hmm.
there is so much, if we put ourselves in a posture to learn from creation, that
Right.
like there's so much more that like this is the first book,
Hmm.
right? This is the first book of this is
Hmm.
the first testament, right?
Right. 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 Right.
And like that there's
Yeah.
so much that we can gain when we're just actually
Right.
putting ourselves in spaces where we can learn.
Right. And the more time we spend out in creation and the more time we spend just learning, that attentionness, or that sort of focus on attention is so important. And that's of course an opportunity into meditation and into sort of more of the mystical monastic practices, right? And that I think we're also a little disconnected from. And I struggle with as a high end extrovert. Like I have a hard time with, I have a friend that goes on silent retreats and I'm very impressed. Um, but like I noticed in myself a week ago at this BTS retreat that there was long periods of silence where we were really focused on our writing, and I actually was starting to like it. And I was thinking, oh, maybe I actually was like, maybe someday I'll go on a silent retreat, which is like a really like amazing thing to like come across my brain, right? But when we're like really focused on really something super specific, whether it's really learning a particular ecosystem so we can hike that trail successfully, or so we can learn the ecology of just our local backyard so that we can heal it, or so we can garden better, or we sit at the feet and allow ourselves to be a student of someone who knows so much more than us, like a Gary Nabin, like a Robin Wall Kimmerer, who can really teach us something. Um, that opens up then the Bible in so many different ways. I hadn't read Gary's work until about 6 years ago. And so First Call Shannon didn't know about that, right? But I do now. And so I think that's the evolution as well that's going on here. And there's so many layers that every piece of creation can teach us, right? Like the little tiny mustard seed can teach us, but the birds, when it grows up 2 years in and is like this amazing tree slash shrub, maybe there's like a really interesting species of bird that's going to land in that mustard seed thing, shrub, 2 years from now that's going to be able to teach us. Like there's layers even just in that one piece of that parable, or the others. Is it the shell, or is it the pearl inside, or is it the guts around the pearl,
Yeah,
or the waterways um, that shell is growing up in, right? Like
yeah.
what's like there's so much you could draw, and it just makes me think that we've got to get our people outside more into these experiential spaces. And if we do have the marsh scientist in our church, or a farmer, or some other
Yeah.
person, like let them lead Bible study and take people on a walk in the marshes and explain it to them. And then we'll pull the passage that has something to do with that. And maybe we'll hear it in a different way and hear Jesus. And maybe that's why those people were on that beach, because they needed to hear him in a different spot and not in their field where they were getting beat up and abused as they were
Mm,
weeding
mm,
and dealing with that wheat. Like maybe they needed to go to Jesus and hear about their fields in a different way so that they could open their minds and imagine a different possibility. And maybe Jesus needed to learn from them too. So I think there's so many things you could be thinking about in a passage like this,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it all gets back to, do we really ever hear God if we're not doing it outside, and if we're not trying to encounter the passage in that way? Like how much are we missing?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's the thing that I keep coming back to is like how much have I
Hmm.
missed personally,
Right.
and how much
Right.
have we missed
Right.
collectively
Yeah.
by trying to do all of this outside. When, as Wendell
Yeah.
Berry has said, like the Bible's a very outside book. It's an outdoor
Yeah.
book.
It's an outdoor book.
It's best read outdoors. So
Yeah. And I want to say this too, like as this thought's coming to me, and this is not a dig at anybody or anything, but so like Jesus brings the disciples back inside in the passage from last week and this week to help them understand. And he's like asking them, like, did you understand? And then they're also asking Jesus paternalistically, at the beginning of 13 in Matthew, like, do you think these people are going to really understand what you're saying? Like,
Mm,
they're in that judgy space
mm,
about
mm,
these, like, kind of like homegrown educated people that are farmers and fishers, right? Like, they're being obnoxious. And uh but Jesus like has to bring them back inside to help them understand. So it just makes me it begs the question, right? Like, we spend so much time inside in the church, in our buildings. Like, is inside education the beginning education?
mm, mm.
And is the outside education the more formative education?
Yeah,
I mean, it makes me wonder,
yeah.
Um
Good questions.
like Jesus was yeah, and like the few times Jesus is inside, like he's getting into trouble, right? It's also like inside is the place where like Jesus does bad things, like he runs away from his parents as a child and like stresses them out and freaks them out, and
Or
like
flips
it's
over
like the child that
tables.
like disappears at the mall and you lose your kid and you like think you're like the worst parent ever. Like, Jesus was terrible to his parents as a child in the temple. Like, I just want to like, or like he got into like fights and like turned over tables and like yelled at people inside. Like, he loses his temper more inside.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's sort of like that inside outside is always an interesting thing to play with too, and like what can that offer us and
Mhm.
how can that heal us. And then there's all those studies about like, being outside is, sometimes better than being on an antidepressant and things like that, and we're beginning to realize like outside really does have healing qualities,
Yeah, yeah,
let alone like the actual plants that have healing qualities.
yeah.
So yeah, so
Well,
much.
so much here. Shannon, thank you so much for this conversation.
I hope the
I love
people who are preaching this Sunday can figure it out.
there's so much here, and I think like each parable has its
Yeah,
own gift, but I think just kind
so
of even
much.
just sitting with the idea of what parables teach us and what parables can do for us, I think it's
Hmm.
just so helpful.
Hmm.
So thank you so much for your time and for this great
Yeah,
conversation.
thanks for chatting. We always end up, yakking away, you and I, but it's fun. And thanks for, having me on. I love this podcast. It's so fabulous.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And